From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Many of the world's problems are so intractable that it's hard to think of ways even to take steps towards mitigating them. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not one of these. On the contrary, the general outlines of a diplomatic solution have been clear for at least 40 years.
We spend the hour with world-renowned linguist and dissident Noam Chomsky in speech and conversation before an audience of 800 people in the hall of the UN General Assembly. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has just announced a plan to investigate Israel's attacks on UN shelters during its recent assault on Gaza. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Pentagon says it's investigating evidence an airdrop of arms intended for Kurdish fighters has ended up in the hands of Islamic State militants. Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby responded to a video posted on YouTube which appears to show the militants with a cache of weapons.
They are certainly of the kinds of material that was dropped with small arms, ammunition, and weaponry. So it's not out of the realm of the possible in that regard. But again, we're taking a look at this, and we just don't know. And when we have something definitive that we can provide in terms of an assessment on that, we'll do that. I do want to add, though, that we are very confident that the vast majority of the bundles did end up in the right hands. In fact, we're only aware of one bundle that did not.
Rear Admiral Kirby said the U.S. had targeted the one bundle that went astray with an airstrike. The airdrops come as part of an effort to defend the Syrian town of Kobani. The Obama administration had previously said Kobani was not a part of its strategic objective, but the Wall Street Journal reports the U.S. was actually working very closely with Syrian Kurdish commanders in secret to defend Kobani. Islamic State militants have renewed their assault on Yazidi religious minorities around Sinjar Mountain in Iraq. Back in August, the militants' advance stranded thousands on the mountain. Obama cited their plight when he authorized U.S. airstrikes in Iraq. On Tuesday, a senior UN official said the Yazidis appear to be facing an attempted genocide. The World Health Organization has announced plans to begin trials of experimental Ebola vaccines with tens of thousands of people in West Africa as early as January. Initial safety trials have already begun and are set to expand to hundreds of volunteers in the United States, Europe, and Africa. Earlier today, a top Red Cross official said the Ebola epidemic in West Africa can be contained in 4 to 6 months. The Obama administration has imposed new travel restrictions for passengers from the countries hardest hit by Ebola. The rules force passengers coming from Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone to pass through one of the 5 U.S. airports, which have implemented enhanced screening. Meanwhile, an American camera person being treated for Ebola in Nebraska and a Spanish nurse who was the first person to contract the virus outside Africa have both been declared Ebola-free. The cultivation of opium poppies in Afghanistan reached an all-time high last year, despite more than $7 billion in U.S. funds to combat the drug trade. In a new report, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, John Sopko, said the record levels, quote, call into question the long-term effectiveness and sustainability of U.S. efforts. North Korea has released an American prisoner who had been held for 5 months. Jeffrey Fowle was arrested in May for leaving a Bible in his hotel room. State Department spokesperson Marie Harf said the U.S. is continuing to push for the release of 2 other Americans still imprisoned in North Korea, Kenneth Bae and Matthew Miller. People around the world are joining an International Day of Action today over the disappearance of 43 students ambushed by police in the Mexican state of Guerrero. The Mexican government has offered rewards for information on the students who've been missing for over 3 weeks. In a separate case, Mexico's Human Rights Commission has concluded soldiers carried out a mass execution and attempted to cover it up. The Mexican army claimed it killed 22 suspected gang members in a shootout last summer in the state of Mexico, but the commission commission found 15 people were likely executed, a number of them lined up and shot. 3 soldiers are facing murder charges. A U.S. Marine suspected of murdering a transgender woman in the Philippines has been transferred to a military camp in Manila after protesters said he was receiving special treatment. Joseph Scott Pemberton was previously being kept on a U.S. Navy ship while Philippine authorities investigate the murder of Jennifer Loud. He's been moved to an air-conditioned van where he's guarded by fellow Marines. Protests have targeted the Visiting Forces Agreement, which lets U.S. soldiers in the Philippines remain in U.S. custody throughout judicial proceedings. President Benigno Aquino defended the accord.
The treaty serves a purpose for our country as it serves a purpose for America. And we live, we are imperfect beings, and this is an imperfect world. One instance of things that nobody, I believe, really wants to happen has happened, but the tragedy will be settled in that the guilty will be made to answer for the crime.
In the United States, federal safety regulators are urging the owner of 7.8 million vehicles made by 10 different companies to act immediately to replace defective airbags. The airbags made by the Japanese company Takata can explode when activated, spraying occupants with sharp metal fragments. The defect has been linked to 4 deaths. Wyoming has become the 32nd state where same-sex marriage is now legal. The move is part of the fallout from a Supreme Court decision earlier this month rejecting appeals from 5 states that sought to ban marriage equality. And former Washington Post editor Ben Bradlee has died at the age of 93. Bradlee served as executive editor of the Washington Post from 1968 to 1991, presiding over its publication of the Pentagon Papers and its coverage of the Watergate scandal, which forced President Richard Nixon to resign. In 1971, Washington Post reporter Betty Metzger received documents stolen by activists from an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, including one bearing the mysterious term COINTELPRO. Metzger spoke on Democracy Now! About how Ben Bradlee fought to publish the story, even though the Washington Post publisher, Katharine Graham, initially had qualms.
It was the first time that she had been faced with a demand from the Nixon administration that she suppress a story. And she did not want to publish. And the in-house counsel, the lawyers, also did not want to publish. But 2 editors from the beginnings realized it was a very important story and pushed it, Ben Bradlee and Ben Bagdikian.
Ben Bradlee died at home of natural causes on Tuesday. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said Tuesday he is setting up an investigation into the attacks on UN facilities during Israel's recent assault on Gaza. Some 2,100 Palestinians, most of them civilian, were killed in the conflict, along with 67 Israeli soldiers and 6 civilians in Israel. Well, today we spend the hour with Professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. He's Institute Professor Emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he's taught for more than half a century. In a rare event that took place last Tuesday, 800 people packed the hall of the UN General Assembly to see Noam Chomsky, ambassadors and the public from around the world. The event was hosted by the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Noam Chomsky gave a major address, and I followed with a public interview. First, the speech.
It's a pleasure to be here to be able to talk with you and discuss with you afterwards. Many of the world's problems are so intractable that it's hard to think of ways even to take steps towards mitigating them. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not one of these. On the contrary, the general outlines of a diplomatic solution have been clear for at least 40 years, not the end of the road, nothing ever is, but a significant step forward. And the obstacles to a resolution are also quite clear. The basic outlines were presented here in a resolution brought to the UN Security Council in January 1976. It called for a 2-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, and now I'm quoting, with guarantees for the rights of both states to exist in peace and security within secure and recognized borders. The resolution was brought by the three major Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, sometimes called the confrontation states. Israel refused to attend the session. The resolution was vetoed by the United States. A U.S. veto typically is a double veto. The resolution is not implemented, and the event is vetoed from history. So you have to look hard to find the record, but it is there. That has set the pattern that has continued since. The most recent U.S. veto was in February 2011. That's President Obama, when his administration vetoed a resolution calling for implementation of official U.S. policy, opposition to expansion of settlements, and it's worth bearing in mind that expansion of settlements is not really the issue, it's the settlements, unquestionably illegal, along with the infrastructure projects supporting them. For a long time, there has been an overwhelming international consensus in support of a settlement along these general lines. The pattern that was set in January 1976 continues to the present. Israel rejects a settlement of these terms and for many years has been devoting extensive resources to ensuring that it will not be implemented with the unremitting and decisive support of the United States, military, economic, diplomatic, and indeed ideological, by establishing how the conflict is viewed and interpreted in the United States and within its broad sphere of influence. There's no time here to review the record, but its general character is revealed by a look at what has happened in Gaza in the past decade, carrying forward a long history of earlier crimes. Last August 26th, a ceasefire was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And the question on all our minds is, what are the prospects for the future? Well, one reasonable way to try to answer that question is to look at the record. And here, too, there is a definite pattern. A ceasefire is reached, Israel disregards it, and continues its steady assault on Gaza, including continued siege, intermittent acts of violence, more settlement and development projects, often violence in the West Bank. Hamas observes the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, until some Israeli escalation elicits a Hamas response, which leads to another exercise of mowing the lawn in Israeli parlance, each episode more fierce and destructive than the last. The first of the series was the agreement on movement and access in November 2005. I'll give a close paraphrase of it. It called for a crossing between Gaza and Egypt at Rafah for the export of goods and the transit of people, continuous operation of crossings between Israel and Gaza for the import and export of goods and the transit of people, reduction of obstacles to movement within the West Bank, bus and truck convoys between the West Bank and Gaza, the building of a seaport in Gaza, the reopening of the airport in Gaza that Israel had recently destroyed. These are essentially the terms of successive ceasefires, including the one just reached a few weeks ago. The timing of the November 2005 agreement is significant. This was the moment of Israel's disengagement, as it's called, from Gaza, the removal of several thousand Israeli settlers from Gaza. This is depicted as a noble effort to seek peace and development, but the reality is rather different. The reality was described very quickly by the Israeli official who was in charge of negotiating and implementing the ceasefire, Dov Weissglass, close confidant of then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. As he explained to the Israeli press, the goal of the disengagement, I'm quoting him, was the freezing of the peace process so as to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state and to ensure that diplomacy has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. The reality on the ground is described by Israel's leading specialists on the occupation, respected historian Idit Zertal, Israel's leading diplomatic correspondent Akiva Eldar wrote the major book, the standard work on the settlement project called Lords of the Land, referring to the settlers. What they say about the disengagement is this. They say the ruined territory, and by then it was ruined, largely part of the reason for the removal of the settlers, the ruined territory was not released for even a single day from Israel's military grip or from the price of the occupation that the inhabitants pay every day. After the disengagement, Israel left behind scorched earth, devastated services, and people with neither a present nor a future. The settlements were destroyed in an ungenerous move by an unenlightened occupier, which in fact continues to control the territory and to kill and harass its inhabitants by means of its formidable military might. That's an accurate description from the most respected Israeli source. The Oslo Accords 20 years ago established that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity whose integrity cannot be broken up. For 20 years, the United States and Israel have been dedicated to separate Gaza and the West Bank in violation of the accords that they had accepted. And a look at the map explains why. Gaza offers the only access to the outside world of Palestine. If Gaza is separated from the West Bank, whatever autonomy might ultimately be granted in the West Bank would be imprisoned. Israel on one side, a hostile Jordan, ally of Israel on the other side, and in addition, one of Israel's slow and steady U.S.-backed policies is to take over the Jordan Valley, about a third of the West Bank, much of the arable land, which would essentially imprison the rest even more tightly if Gaza is separated from the West Bank. Now, that's the major geostrategic reason for the Israeli insistence with U.S. backing on separating the two in violation of the Oslo agreements and the series of ceasefires that have been reached since November 2005. Well, the November 2005 agreement lasted for a few weeks. In January 2006, a very important event took place. the first full free election in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair. It had one flaw. It came out the wrong way. Hamas won the parliament, control of the parliament. U.S. and Israel didn't want that. You may recall at that period, the slogan on everyone's lips was democracy promotion. The highest U.S. commitment in the world was democracy promotion. Here was a good test. Democracy. Election came out the wrong way. The U.S. instantly decided, along with Israel, to punish the Palestinians for the crime of voting the wrong way. A harsh siege was instituted, other punishments, violence increased. The United States immediately began to organize a military coup to overthrow the unacceptable government. That's quite familiar practice. I won't go through the record. The European Union, to its shame and discredit, went along with this. There was an immediate Israeli escalation. That was the end of the November agreement, followed by major Israeli onslaughts. In 2007, a year later, Hamas committed even a greater crime than winning a fair election. It preempted the planned military coup and took over the Gaza. That's described in the West, in the United States, most of the West, as Hamas's taking over Gaza by force, which is not false, but something is omitted. The force was preempting a planned military coup to overthrow the elected government. That was a serious crime. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election. To preempt a U.S. planned military coup is far more serious. The attack on Gaza increased substantially at that point, major Israeli onslaughts. Finally, in January 2008, another ceasefire was reached. Terms were pretty much the same as those that I quoted. Israel publicly rejected the ceasefire, said that it would not abide by it. Hamas observed the ceasefire, as Israel officially recognizes, despite Israel's refusal to do so. That continued until November 4th, 2008. On November 4th, which was the day of the U.S. election, Israeli forces invaded Gaza, killed half a dozen Hamas militants. That led to Qassam rockets attacking Israel, huge Israeli response, lots of killings, all Palestinians as usual. By the end of December, a couple of weeks later, Hamas offered to renew the ceasefire. The Israeli cabinet considered it, rejected it. This was a dovish cabinet led by Ehud Olmert, rejected it and decided to launch the next major military operation. That was Cast-led, which was a horrible operation, so much so that it caused a very substantial international reaction, investigations by the United Nations Commission, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. In the middle of this assault, the assault, incidentally, was carefully timed to end immediately before President Obama's inauguration. He had already been elected, but he wasn't inaugurated yet. So when he was asked to comment on the ongoing atrocities, he responded by saying that he couldn't do so. The United States has only one president, and he wasn't president yet. He was talking about lots of other things, but not this. The attack was timed to end immediately before the inauguration, so he therefore could respond to the questions by saying, well, now's not the time to look at the past, let's look forward to the future. Diplomats know very well that that's a standard slogan for those who are engaged in serious crime. Let's forget about the past. Let's look forward to a glorious future. Well, that was right in the middle of the assault. The Security Council did pass a resolution unanimously, U.S. abstaining, calling for an immediate ceasefire with the usual terms. That was January 8th, 2009. It was never observed, and it broke down completely with the next major episode of mowing the lawn in November 2012. You can get a good sense of what was going on by looking at the casualty figures for the year 2012. 79 people were killed, 78 of them Palestinians. The usual story.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking last Tuesday in the hall of the UN General Assembly before 800 people in an event hosted by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. We'll return to his speech and my public interview with him in a moment. Marcel Khalifa here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we return to Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. Last week, Professor Chomsky, in a rare event, spoke in the hall of the UN General Assembly to about 800 people, a number of them ambassadors and the public from around the world. He talked about the aftermath of the November 2012 Israeli assault on Gaza.
After the November assault, there was a ceasefire reached with the usual terms. I'll describe what happened next by quoting a leading specialist, Nathan Thrall. He's a leading Middle East analyst for the International Crisis Group. As he writes, Israel recognized that Hamas was observing the terms of the ceasefire and therefore saw little incentive in doing the same. The military attacks on Gaza increased, along with more stringent restrictions on imports. Exports were blocked. Exit permits were blocked. That continued until April 2014, when Palestinians committed another crime. Gaza-based Hamas and West Bank-based Palestinian Authority signed a unity agreement. Israel was infuriated even more when the world mostly supported it. Even the United States gave weak but actual support. Several reasons for the Israeli reaction. One is that unity between Gaza and the West Bank, between the two movements, would threaten the long-standing policies of separating the two, for the reasons that I mentioned. Another reason was that a unity government undermines one of the pretexts for Israel's refusal to participate in negotiations seriously, namely, how can we negotiate with an entity that is internally divided? Well, if they're unified, that pretext disappears. Israel was infuriated. It launched major assaults on the Palestinians in the West Bank, primarily targeting Hamas, hundreds of people arrested, mostly Hamas members, also Gaza, also killings. There was a pretext, of course, there always is. The pretext was that 3 teenagers, Israeli teenagers in the settlements, had been brutally murdered, captured and murdered. Israel claimed officially that they thought that they were alive, so therefore launched a long, several weeks assault in the West Bank, alleging that they were trying to find them alive. Meanwhile, the arrests, attacks, and so on. It turns out that they knew immediately that they had been killed. They also knew immediately that it was very unlikely that Hamas was involved. The government said they had certain knowledge that Hamas had done it, but their own leading specialists, like Shlomo Drori, had pointed out right away that the assault, which was a brutal crime, was very likely committed by members of a breakaway clan, Qasmi clan, in Hebron, which was not given a green light by Hamas and had been a thorn in their sides. And that apparently is true if you look at the later arrests and punishments. Anyway, that was a pretext for this assault, killings in Gaza too. That finally elicited a Hamas response. Then came Operation Protective Edge, the one which was just completed, more brutal and destructive, even the ones that preceded it. The pattern is very clear, and so far at least it appears to be continuing. The latest ceasefire was reached on August 26th. It was followed at once by Israel's greatest land grab in 30 years, almost 1,000 acres in the Gush Etzion area near what's called Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, about 5 times the size of anything that Jerusalem ever was, taken over by Israel, annexed in violation of Security Council orders. The U.S. State Department informed the Israeli embassy that Israeli, I'm quoting it now, Israeli activity in Gush Etzion undermines American efforts to protect Israel at the United Nations, and urged that Israel shouldn't provide ammunition for those at the United Nations who would interpret Israel's position as hardening. Actually, that warning was given 47 years ago, in September 1967, at the time of Israel's first colonization, illegal colonization of Gush Etzion. Israeli historian Gershom Gorenberg recently reminded us of this. Little has changed since, in the last 47 years, apart from the scale of the crimes, which continue without a break with constant U.S. support. Well, as for the prospects, there is a conventional picture. It's repeated constantly on all sides. Israel, Palestine, independent commentators, diplomats. The picture that's presented is that there are 2 alternatives: either the 2-state settlement, which represents an overwhelming international consensus, virtually everyone, and if that fails, there'll have to be 1 state. Israel will take over the West Bank. The Palestinians will hand over the keys, as it's sometimes said. Palestinians often have favored that. They say then they'll be able to carry out a civil rights struggle, maybe modeled on the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, fight for civil rights within the whole 1 state controlled by Israel. Israelis criticize that on the grounds of what is called the demographic problem, the fact that there will be too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, in fact, pretty soon a majority. Those are the alternatives that are presented, overwhelmingly, hardly an exception. My own opinion, which I've written about repeatedly without convincing many people apparently, but I'll try to convince you, is that this is a total illusion. Those are not the two alternatives. There are two alternatives, but they're different ones. One alternative is the international consensus on a two-state settlement, basically the terms of January 1976. By now, it's virtually everyone. The Arab League, the Organization of Islamic States, includes Iran, Europe, Latin America, formal at least about everyone. That's one option. The other option, the realistic one, is that Israel will continue doing exactly what it is doing right now, before our eyes. It's visible, with U.S. support, which is also visible. And what's happening is not a secret. You can open the newspapers and read it. Israel is taking over what they call Jerusalem, as I mentioned, a huge area, maybe 5 times the area of historic Jerusalem, Greater Jerusalem, big area in the West Bank, includes many Arab villages being dispossessed, destroyed, bringing settlers in. All of this is doubly illegal. All the settlements are illegal, as determined by the Security Council, advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. But the Jerusalem settlements are doubly illegal because they are also in violation of explicit Security Council orders going back to 1968, with the U.S. actually voting for them at that time, barring any change in the status of Jerusalem. But it continues. That's Greater Jerusalem. There are then corridors extending to the east. One major corridor extending from Jerusalem almost to Jericho, virtually bisecting the West Bank, includes the Israeli town of Ma'ale Adumim, which was built largely during the Clinton administration, Clinton years, with the obvious purpose of bisecting the West Bank. Still a little contested territory, but that's the goal. There's another corridor further to the north, including the town of Ariel, partially bisecting what remains, another one further to the north, including the town of Kadumim. If you look at the map, these essentially break up the West Bank into pretty much cantons. It looks from a map as though a large territory is left, but that's misleading. Most of that is uninhabitable desert. And that's separate from what I mentioned before, the slow, steady takeover of the Jordan Valley to the east. Again, about a third of the arable land, the country. Israel has no official policy of taking it over, but they're pursuing the policy in the way that has been carried out now for 100 years, literally. Small steps, so nobody notices, or at least people pretend not to notice. Establish a military zone. The Palestinians who live there have to be displaced because it's a military zone, no settlement allowed. And pretty soon there's a military settlement, Nahal settlement, or another. Then sooner or later it becomes an actual settlement. Meanwhile, dig wells, dispossess the population, set up green zones, a large variety of techniques which have by now reduced the Arab population from about 300,000 in 1967 to roughly 60,000 today. As I mentioned, that essentially imprisons what's left. I don't think Israel has any intention of taking over the Palestinian population concentrations, which are left out of these plans. There are analogies often made to South Africa, but they're quite misleading. South Africa relied on its black population. That was 85% of the population. It was its workforce, and they had to sustain them, just like slave owners have to maintain their capital. They tried to sustain the population. They even tried to gain international support for the Bantustans. Israel has no such attitude toward the Palestinians. They don't want to have anything to do with them. If they leave, that's fine. If they die, that's fine. In standard neo-colonial pattern, Israel is permitting the establishment of a center for Palestinian elites in Ramallah, where you have nice restaurants and theaters and so on. Every third world country under the colonial system had something like that. That's the picture that's emerging. It's taking shape before our eyes. It has so far worked very well. If it continues, Israel will not face a demographic problem. When these regions are integrated slowly into Israel, actually the proportion of Jews in greater Israel will increase. There are very few Palestinians there. Those who are there are being dispossessed, kicked out. That's what's taking shape before our eyes. I think that's the realistic alternative to a two-state settlement, and there's every reason to expect it to continue as long as the United States supports it.
Professor Noam Chomsky speaking last Tuesday in the hall of the UN General Assembly before about 800 people, ambassadors and the public alike. The event was hosted by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. After he spoke, I interviewed him in front of the audience. We'll play highlights after break.
شباب ومئات البنات نطلع على جبل الهوا ببلاش ما بدنا حدا يطلعنا شاف ارفعوا كاس كل الناس بتعمل حماس علوا صوت لنكسر آذان زقزق آذان أريد كل ولد لبنت من بلد لبلد يرتبط بالسلمين ومسيحيون ما في فرق بينه وبينكم وينكم ارفعوا ايديكم ليكم ليكم وزعوا الكلمة مني السلام عليكم الحقوني هيدي رقص الأندلسية وهيدي دبكة فلسطينية كتروا الشعب اللبنانية مية.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to MIT professor Noam Chomsky, world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author. Last week, he spoke before over 800 people in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly, before ambassadors and the public alike, on the issue of Israel and Palestine. After his speech, I conducted a public interview with Professor Chomsky. What do you think is the single most important action the United States can take, and what about its role over the years? What is its interest here?
Well, one important action that the United States could take is to live up to its own laws. Of course, it would be nice if it lived up to international law, but maybe that's too much to ask. But live up to its own laws. And there are several. And here, incidentally, I have in mind advice to activists also, who I think ought to be organizing and educating in this direction. There are two crucial cases. One of them is what's called the Leahy Law. Patrick Leahy, Senator Leahy, introduced legislation called the Leahy Law, which bars sending weapons to any military units which are involved in consistent human rights violations. There isn't the slightest doubt that the Israeli army is involved in massive human rights violations, which means that all dispatch of U.S. arms to Israel is in violation of U.S. law. I think that's significant. The U.S. should be called upon by its own citizens and by others to adhere to U.S. law, which also happens to conform to international law in this case, as Amnesty International, for example, for years has been calling for an arms embargo against Israel for this reason. These are all steps that can be taken. The second is the tax-exempt status that is given to organizations in the United States which are directly involved in the occupation and in significant at attacks on human and civil rights within Israel itself, like the Jewish National Fund. Take a look at its charter with the State of Israel, which commits it to acting for the benefit of people of Jewish race, religion, and origin within Israel. One of the consequences of that is that by a complex array of laws and administrative practices, the fund pretty much administers about 90% of the land of the country, with real consequences for who can live places. They get tax-exempt status also for their activities in the West Bank, which are strictly criminal. I think that's also straight in violation of U.S. law. Now, those are important things, and I think the U.S. should be pressured internationally and domestically to abandon its virtually unique role, unilateral role in blocking a political settlement for the past 40 years, ever since the first veto in January 1976. That should be a major issue in the media, in convocations like this, in the United Nations, in domestic politics, and government politics, and so on.
The role of the media, can you talk about that, and particularly in the United States? And do you think that the opinion in the United States, public opinion, is shifting on this issue?
Well, the role of the media are somewhat shifting from uniform support for virtually everything that Israel does to, and of course, silence about the U.S. role. That's not just in the case of Israel, that's innumerable other cases as well. But it's slowly shifting, but nevertheless, one about, say, Operation Protective Edge, one can read in news reporting in the New York Times, major journal, a criticism of Hamas's assault on Israel during Protective Edge. Hamas's assault on Israel. Not exactly what happened, but that's what people are reading, and that's the way it's depicted. Israel is, over and over, it's pointed out, look, poor Israel is under attack. It has the right of self-defense. Everyone agrees to that. Actually, I agree too. Everyone has a right of self-defense. But that's not the question. The question is, do you have a right of self-defense by force, by violence? The answer is no for anyone, whether it's an individual or a state, unless you have exhausted peaceful means. If you won't even permit peaceful means, which is the case here, then you have no right of self-defense by violence. But try to find a word about that in the media. All you find is self-defense. When President Obama rarely says anything about what's happening, it's usually, if my daughters were being attacked by rockets, I would do anything to stop it. He's referring not to the Palestinian, hundreds of Palestinian children who are being killed and slaughtered, but to the children in the Israeli town of Sderot, which is under attack by Qassam missiles. And remember that Israel knows exactly how to stop those missiles, namely live up to a ceasefire for the first time. And then they would stop, as in the past, even when Israel didn't live up to a ceasefire. That framework, and of course the rest of the framework is the United States is an honest broker trying hard to bring the two recalcitrant sides together, doing its best in this noble endeavor, has nothing to do with the case. The U.S. is, as some of the U.S. negotiators have occasionally acknowledged, Israel's lawyer. If there were serious negotiations going on, they would be led by some neutral party, maybe Brazil, which has some international respect, and they would bring together the two sides. On the one side, Israel and the United States on the other side, the Palestinians. Those would be possible realistic negotiations. But the chances of anyone in the media either, I won't even say pointing it out, even thinking about it is minuscule. The indoctrination is so deep that really elementary facts like these, and they are elementary, are almost incomprehensible. But to get back to the last point you mentioned, it's very important. Opinion in the United States is shifting. Not as fast as in most of the world, not as fast as in Europe. It's not reaching the point where you could get a vote in Congress, anything like the British Parliament a couple days ago. But it is changing, mostly among younger people, and changing substantially. I'll just illustrate with personal experience. Amy has the same experience. Until pretty recently, when I gave talks on these topics, as I've been doing for 40 years, I literally had to have police protection. Even at my own university, MIT, police would insist on walking me back to my car because of threats they'd picked up. Meetings were broken up and so on. That's all gone. Just a couple of days ago, I had a talk on these topics at MIT. Meeting wasn't broken up, no police protection. Maybe 500 or 600 students were there, all enthusiastic, engaged, committed, concerned, wanting to do something about it. That's happening all over the country. All over the country. Palestinian solidarity is one of the biggest issues on campus. Enormous change in the last few years. That's the way things tend to change. It often starts with younger people. Gradually, it gets to the rest of the population. Efforts of the kind I mentioned, say trying to get the United States government to live up to its own laws, those could be undertaken on a substantial scale, domestically and with support from international institutions, and that could lead to further changes. I think that for example, the two things that I mentioned would have a considerable appeal to much of the American public. Why should they be funding military units that are carrying out massive human rights violations? Why should they be permitting a tax exemption, meaning we pay for it? That's what a tax exemption means. Why should we be compelled to pay for violations of fundamental human rights in another country and even in occupied territories where it's criminal? I think that can appeal to the American population and can lead to the kinds of changes we've seen in other cases.
Final question before we open it up to each of you. Your thoughts on the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, sanctions movement?
Well, the BDS is a set of tactics, right? These are tactics that you employ when you think they're going to be effective and in ways that you think will be effective. Tactics are not principles. They're not actions that you undertake no matter what because you think they're right. Tactics are undertaken if you're serious because you think they're going to help the victims. That's how you adjust your tactics. Not because I think they're right in principle, but because I think they will be beneficial. That ought to be second nature to activists. Also, second nature should be a crucial distinction between proposing and advocating. I can propose now that we should all live in peace and love each other. I just proposed it. It's not a serious proposal. It becomes a serious proposal when it becomes advocacy. It is given, I sketch out a path for getting from here to there. Then it becomes serious. Otherwise, it's empty words. That's crucial and related to this. Well, when you take a look at the BDS movement, which is separate, incidentally, from BDS tactics, let me make that clear. So when the European Union issued its directive, or when that I mentioned, or when, say, the Gates Foundation withdraws investment in security operations that are being carried out not only in the occupied territories but elsewhere, that's very important. But that's not the BDS movement. That's BDS tactics, actually, BD tactics, boycott, divestment tactics. That's important. The BDS movement itself has been an impetus to these developments, and in many ways a positive one, but I think it has failed and should reflect on its so far unwillingness to face what are crucial questions for activists. What's going to help the victims and what's going to harm them? What is a proposal and what is real advocacy? You have to think that through, and it hasn't been sufficiently done. So if you take a look at the principles of the BDS movement, there are three. They vary slightly in wording, but basically three. One is action should be directed against the occupation. That has been extremely successful in many ways, and it makes sense. It also helps educate the Western populations who are being appealed to participate. It's an opening to discuss, investigate, organize about the participation in the occupation. It's very successful. A second principle is that BDS actions should be continued until Israel allows the refugees to return. That has had no success, and to the extent that it's been tried, it's been negative. It just leads to a backlash. No basis has been laid for it among the population. It is simply interpreted as saying, oh, you want to destroy the state of Israel. We're not going to destroy a state. You cannot undertake actions which you think are principled when in the real world they are going to have a harmful effect on the victims. There's a third category having to do with civil rights within Israel, and there are things that could be done here. One of the ones I mentioned, in fact, the tax-free status for U.S. organizations that are engaged in civil rights and human rights violations. And remember, a tax exemption means I pay for it. That's what a tax exemption is. Well, that's an action that could be undertaken. Others that have been undertaken have had backlashes which are harmful. And I won't run through the record, but these are the kinds of questions that always have to be asked when you're involved in serious activisms, if you care about the victims. Not just feeling good, but caring about the victims. That's critically important.
MIT professor, world-renowned linguist, dissident Noam Chomsky, speaking last Tuesday in the hall of the United Nations General Assembly before 800 people in an event hosted by the UN Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. We wish a very happy birthday to our video producer, Robbie Karen. For all our New York viewers, Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez will be one of the journalists questioning the New York gubernatorial candidates in tonight's debate. The debate will be broadcast live at 8 p.m. on PBS stations across New York. I'll be speaking in Vienna, Austria, Friday at an event hosted by ORF, Austria's public broadcaster. Then on Saturday, speaking at the Elevate Festival in Graz, Austria. Again, you can go to democracynow.org for more details. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Aaron Mate, Nermeen Sheikh, Steve Martinez, Sam Alkoff, Hani Massoud, Ravi Karen, Dina Guzder, Amy Littlefield. Special thanks to Daniel Bagun and Anna Ozbek, and Sam Riddell. Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, engineer. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.